tonight's Torah portion from Genesis chapter 12, 1 to 17, 27, Lech Lecha. And Veronica is correct. Lech Lecha, go to yourself. Or go find yourself, some people say. But I think from what I've read, what I've looked at on the internet from different sites, Lech Lecha, a better translation is get you out, go for yourself. That was represented 2 or 3 times, and I think from the standpoint of these people who are proficient in Hebrew, they believe that that's a better translation. Get you out, go for yourself. Lech Lecha. All right, tonight's Torah portion is really about faith. Abraham received his initial word of faith, and he followed after God. So we'll talk about that here in a few moments. So I have a Hebrew word for you other than Lech Lecha, which is a phrase. And the Hebrew word I have for you is from tonight's Torah portion. It's hasab. Hasab, which is credit. We're going to see that here in a few moments. The King James says reckoned. It was reckoned onto Abraham. The New American Standard says credit. And the word there is the same in Hebrew, hasab. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. So we have 3 points of interest. And the 3 points of interest is 1, Lech Lecha, Abraham's initial word of faith. This is his very first initiating directive that he received from God. The second point of interest would be Abraham or Avram, man in the spirit, Lot, man in the flesh. And we'll explain that, we'll discuss that in a few moments. So also the third point of interest will be God's covenant with Abraham. So very simple, Lech Lecha, Abraham's initial word of faith. Abraham, a man of the spirit or a man in the spirit. Lot, a man in the flesh. God's covenant with Abraham. So let's talk about the first point of interest, Lech Lecha. So this is Abraham's initial word of faith that he received from God. And let's read that. In Genesis chapter 12, I'm going to read 1 to 4. This is where God begins to interact with Abraham. Before this, God interacted, obviously, I think to some extent, with Terah, the father of Abraham. Now, quite frankly, we don't know if God interacted with him, but certainly God was involved in bringing Terah and Abraham and his family all the way from Ur of the Chaldeans to Haran in Padan Aram. Haran. So Padan Aram, which is in the region of today's Turkey, northern Iraq, Turkey. Padan Aram. It's a region of the Arameans. And the Arameans are still there today. The descendants of the Arameans are still there today. There are many Aramean Christians that are very active in that part of the world, even to today. It's eastern Turkey. I think most of Padan Aram, ancient Padan Aram, is in the region of Turkey. And the Christians, these Christians are very ancient. I think someone decided that they are the most ancient sect of Christianity in the world, which is quite impressive, right? These Syrians, these Aramean Christians, amazing. And they speak in the ancient Aramean language, and they worship in the ancient Aramean language. I paid some attention to that a couple of years ago, and it's pretty amazing. So God called Terah, or appointed Terah, to leave Ur of the Chaldeans and go to Padan Aram, the region of where his son, Haran, his son was Haran. And from there, God spoke to Abraham. So God spoke to Abraham from Padan Aram and spoke to him concerning going to the land that he would show him. Lech Lecha, go for yourself. So let's read chapter 12, 1 to 4. Now the Lord said to Avram, remember at this point his name is Avram, not Abraham, not Avraham. What's the difference between Avram and Avraham? Avraham was the name that God changed his name to. His name was Avram, which is father. Avraham means exalted father. Exalted father. So go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. So he is to leave his father's house. Remember, Terah died. He died in Padan Aram. And Abraham is being called by God to leave, to walk away from the whole family. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. So you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So in these verses 1 and 2, well, 1 to 3, we find the basis of God's covenant with Abraham, what God will provide. All right, so that's how we look at the covenant, what's provided by God and what's required from Abraham. We know what's required from Abraham. What is required from Abraham? Faith. To hear and obey. Every covenant that God cuts with anyone, even with ourselves, because we're a part of that covenant, the provisions are many. God provides much more than he requires. All he requires is a faith walk for us to hear and obey. And that's the truth for every covenant. The nation of Israel, they had 613 laws, statutes, and commandments. But their requirement was the same. To obey God's word, to obey his direction, to follow after him. And what would he provide Israel? Tremendous provisions. So the provisions always outweigh the requirements. And this is what God is saying to Abraham, go, and I will provide for you, but you must just follow after me. You must go. So in verse 4, so Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. So verse 4 is important. It shows that Abraham simply responded. Now, let's talk a little bit about his faith being expressed here. The ancient world was not like it is today. It was perilous in many ways. You had wild beasts. You had lions in that part of the world. You had wolves. You had bears. It was a perilous thing to just leave and leave by yourself with your wife and whoever else is with you, and go on this journey, not knowing where you're going or what the outcome of it would be. So it required a tremendous amount of trust. In the ancient world, you had raiders. You had the Akkadians who were raiders. They would descend upon travelers and just take everything and kill them and leave them on the spot. The ancient world was a difficult place if you didn't have an army. Now, of course, later on we see that Abraham, he had an army. But initially, perhaps he didn't. So, Abraham simply went. He trusted God and he followed after God. He acted on the word that God gave him. And that's the basis of faith. Abraham heard from God and he obeyed. So he had a word of faith. Now, the book of Hebrews chapter 11, gives us a picture of the people of faith that we see in the Old Testament. And of course, Abraham is right at the top of that list. So let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to read here concerning Abraham, or Avram. He's Abraham at this point. We're going to read verse 8 to 11 concerning the courage and the faith and the determination to follow after God. Verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to the place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. So the writer of the book of Hebrews captures in verse 8 the reality of the response. He didn't know where he was going. He simply heard and he responded. So it's implied there in verse 8 of Hebrews chapter 11 that it was a perilous journey. It was at least a very difficult journey, but Abraham did not hesitate. He went after God's word, even though he didn't know what the outcome would be. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect is the builder of God. So that reference there that we see in verse 10, it talks about a city with foundations. It's referring to the promise of faith. So the writer of the book of Hebrews is referring to the promise by faith. The word of faith was a foundation, a city, he said. How did he refer to the city? A city whose architect is God. So effectively, you can take away from that a life built in faith is like a strong foundation, and a city designed by God, is what the writer of the book of Hebrews is saying. So I want us to see there that Abraham trusted God. Even though it wasn't certain, he didn't know where he was going. He was going to live as a stranger in a land that's not his. Who were the people of Avram? The Arameans. Avram was an Aramean. The people of, like I said, Eastern Turkey today, they were Assyrians, Arameans. They were his natural people. In fact, so much so that whenever there was a need for a wife for Isaac and for Jacob, they went back to Padan Aram, the region of the Arameans, because the people of the land of Canaan were not their people. But Abraham was willing to lay that all before God and follow after him and live as an alien, according to what the writer of the book of Hebrews said. So this is the faith of Avram. He trusted God. Now, the Bible tells us, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 1, verse 17, that the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. This is the experience of Avram. We're going to see here in a few moments that the righteousness that Abraham or Avram would ultimately attain came from his faith. The just, the righteous shall live by faith. And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Again, reckoned or credited to him, the Hebrew word is asab, which means to attribute or to give to. So Abraham, righteousness from faith to faith. He obeyed God initially. He left Haran, Padan Aram. He left. He just took what he had and he left. Courageous act. That was his initial step of faith. And the righteousness of God that he attained came from faith to faith. Now, we know that Abraham wavered a little bit here and there, right? We know it. In a couple of ways, which we'll talk about as we study through the Torah portions. Nevertheless, he trusted God, and he won a testimony being righteous because of his faith. All right, let's talk about Abraham now, second point of interest, a man in the spirit, and Lot, a man in the flesh. Now, why do I make such a statement? First of all, Paul, in the book of Romans chapter 6, 7, and 8, Paul compares the person who walks by faith as being in the spirit. And you really have to study those 3 chapters. The person who obeys God and walks by faith is the person who is in the spirit. The person who is in the flesh is the person that's not walking by faith. And this is Paul's argument in that portion of the book of Romans. Paul had several arguments in the book of Romans, but that particular portion of the book dealt with people that were in the spirit, walking by faith, and contrasting them with people that were in the flesh, who were not trusting God, who were not walking by faith. So this is the comparison that I'm using to draw light on Abraham and Lot. So verse 4 of chapter 12, Genesis, we read there that, so Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. Tremendous act of faith. But then the rest of the verse says, and Lot went with him. Lot went with him. Did God call Lot? Do we see anywhere where God spoke to Lot? But Lot went along with him. So we're left to wonder exactly what happened. What transpired? How did Lot end up going with Abraham? Did Abraham initiate that? We don't know. But the way it's worded here, where it says that Lot went with him, you get the impression that this was Lot's idea, something that he initiated. Perhaps, and this is just perhaps, Abraham perhaps entertained the idea of having Lot with him, because Lot was younger, and Lot had flocks, and Lot had, perhaps servants with him and so on, wives, we don't know. And so it's good to have Lot, his nephew, with him. Safety in numbers, perhaps. Perhaps that was Abraham's idea, that Lot will come along and he will help in that there would be safety in numbers, and his people can be with my people, and they can integrate and work together. We're going to see here in a few moments that just didn't work. And the fact that it became an issue might have something to do with what I just proposed to you, that there was an idea that Lot's men and Abraham's men, they can work together, and there's safety in numbers, right? Because, again, it was a difficult thing to do, to travel about in the ancient world with just one clan, one family. Abraham and Sarah, and they were old. He was 75 years old, and Sarah was perhaps 70 at the time. So they were vulnerable. Lot goes along. But Lot was never called to go anywhere with Abraham. But he goes. Abraham entertains it, and Lot had no word of faith, and this would ultimately lead to a complete disaster. And that disaster is still being felt today. That disaster is still living on even to today. The Jordanians of today, who have been committed enemies of Israel, right? Every time Israel was attacked by surrounding nations, Jordan was at the helm of it. So when you consider the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the conditions of Jerusalem right now, with the authority, the Muslim authority in Jerusalem, the Jordanian authorities in Jerusalem, how oppressive they can be, and the very fact that the Jordanians has possession of that Temple Mount to a great extent. And by the way, your favorite president gave the Jordanians and the Saudi Arabians even more authority on that Temple Mount back in the last elections, 2019. Now, that's a tragedy. We talk. When was the elections? 2020? 2020? Yeah, 2020. So he, because of his desire to be the great president, to strike a deal between Israel and the Arabs, he came up with the Abrahamic Accords, using the name of Abraham in this process. Should have never been done. He should have. It was a land for deal. In fact, it was a temple of God for peace deal. Give up some of the Temple Mount, and the Arabs will get along better with you, and everyone will get along, which didn't happen. The Jordanians of today are the sons of Lot. They are the people of Moab and Ammon. They are the descendants of Moab and Ammon. Lot's sons. Now, interesting fact about the people of Jordan, the descendants of Ammon and Moab, is that people were never displaced. There was very little integration within the people of Ammon and the people of Moab. In other words, they remained more or less the sons of Lot. So today's Jordanians are by and large mostly descendants of Lot. And they are horribly aggressive towards Israel, even to today. So you see, Lot's involvement with Abraham should have never occurred. And the very fact that this continues to be an impediment to Israel today bears witness to the fact of what I'm saying. Lot had no word of faith. He was in the flesh as he went forward. Abraham was in the spirit because he had a word of faith and he was obeying God. Now, you will see very clearly when we read here in a few moments the reality that Abraham's approach to coming into the land was that of faith, that of a man in the spirit. Whereas Lot, no faith, he's in the flesh. And I need you to see that. I want you to see that. When you don't have a word of faith, it's easy to get into the flesh, where you're doing things simply for other reasons than what God's reasons are. Quite often, when God gives us a word of faith, there is very little reasoning behind it from our perspectives. In other words, Abraham was called to go. Where, he didn't know. Did it make sense? No. But he was called upon to simply believe God and go. Many times a word of faith will have that same effect. We don't know where, we don't know how, we don't even know why, but God has said, do this or go here. And that's how we respond. When we're in the flesh, we have to have everything laid out before us. Here is what I'm doing, here is why I'm doing it, or here is why I'm not doing it. You're in the flesh. When you have God's affirmation, when you have His word, you're in the spirit. And that's why I encourage people all the time to have a word of faith. You walk in the Spirit when you do. That's what Paul's argument is. So let's read now so again, verse 4, chapter 12, and Lot went with him. Never had a word of faith. God waited until there was a separation between Abraham and Lot to further the process of bringing Abraham to the point where he can cut a covenant with Abraham. And we're going to see that here in a few moments in chapter 13, 14 to 18. Yes, I'll say it again. God waited until there was a separation between Lot and Abraham to further his covenant concerning God's promises to Abraham. Let's read about that. 14 to 18. The Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, so Lot separated. God then spoke to Abraham after Lot was separated. Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward, for all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. This was spoken to Abraham after Lot was separated. God waited for that separation. To a certain extent, we can say that God created the catalyst for that separation. I believe he did. We'll see here in a few moments that there arose strife between Lot's men and Abraham's men. Naturally, there would be strife because Abraham is in the spirit, walking by faith. Lot is in the flesh, doing everything in his own strength, based on his own conventional wisdom. So yes, there will be strife. You cannot, let me say this, you cannot successfully walk with a brother or sister who's in the flesh. If you are walking in the Spirit of God and you're walking by faith, you will find it very difficult to walk with someone who is simply doing what seems right in their own eyes. Walking in the flesh. You would find it very, very difficult. And this is what led to the strife between Abraham and Lot. So verse 15, for the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can be numbered. That's the promise being reiterated to him, right? That was given in chapter 12. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abraham moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre. Where's the oaks of Mamre? Hebron. Where the cave of Machpelah is today. Hebron is where he moved to. Kiryat Arba. Kiryat Arba is there today. Which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So as he's going along, he went from Shechem, where in Shechem, which is today's Nablus, in Shechem, he built an altar and he offered up sacrifices to God. Korbanot, right? So he provided. Oh, interesting factor, I want to tell you about this. I was teaching the Pakistani congregation last Friday, and I mentioned the word offering. And he interpreted what I was saying in Urdu, and came out of his mouth was the word korbanot. So the Pakistani, the Urdu, the Pakistani word for korbanot is korbanot. And I've discovered from listening to him as he translates my English that many of the words they use are Hebrew words, many of them. And it's shocking, I pick them up all the time. So let's get back to the point. Abraham made offerings, korbanot, to God at Hebron, at Shechem. He also stopped at Bethel and he made offerings to God, korbanot, at Bethel as well. But then here we see him, God says to him, pick yourself up and go, travel the land. He goes down south and he goes to Hebron, the oaks of Mamre, and he offers korbanot there to God as well. It is in that area that God will then cut the covenant with him, establish the covenant. Keep in mind, to this point, the covenant isn't cut. God is sort of preparing Abraham, allowing him to offer korbanot, offerings to God in different spots in the land. And he's walking about in the land. What is God waiting on to establish the covenant? We'll see that here in a few moments. What was essential was the separation of Lot. Lot had to be separated completely. in order for this to happen. So, let's read now concerning the strife between Lot and Avram, or Abraham. And what we're going to see here is that Lot chooses in the flesh. He's in the flesh, so he chooses in the flesh what seemed best, what seemed most practical, what seemed to favor his situation more than anything else. Let's read it. Verse 8 to 13. So Avram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me. So who is initiating the peace? Who is initiating the desire or the movement towards Yachad, unity? Avram. Again, he's in the spirit. He's walking by faith. He's believing God. He's trusting God. He sees that there's strife between himself and his nephew. He's discerning for sure that there has to be a separation. This is the Spirit of God speaking to Avram, and he initiates it. You see? And that's why Jesus would say to us clearly in Matthew chapter 5, if you have aught against your brother or your sister, or if you realize that your brother or sister has aught against you, go to them. So the one in the Spirit is the one who will initiate the process of reconciliation. That's what we take away from this. The one in the flesh will not. Will remain in the flesh. In fact, will be confronted by the need for separation. Or utilize it to their best interest. So let's read. So Avram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. That's Abraham speaking in faith in the Spirit. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. If to the right, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, the Yarden. So he looks to the valley of the Jordan. What does he see? That it was well watered everywhere. That this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So what's the purpose of that insert? This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The implications are clear. Before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, the land was well watered, not with salt water, but with fresh water. It was a land of bountifulness. And that's the point to that insert. So naturally, Lot chooses the well-watered land, the grasslands of the Jordan Valley. So that tells us that before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and caused the entire land to be salted, what did he do? What was it like before then? It was a well-watered, fertile land. Clearly, there was grass and pastures there because that's what Lot chose for himself. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, based on that insert that we see here, after that destruction, the land became salted and a wasteland. You see that? Like the garden of the Lord, like the garden of the land of Egypt, as you do to Zohar. Okay. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Avram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, exceedingly sinners against God. So what happened? Abraham chose a difficult terrain. He accepted that difficult land, hill country, not the best land for pasture and flocks. He chose that by faith. Lot, in his strength, in his own flesh, chose the land that was obviously more prosperous, more bountiful. So you see here, the man of faith, the person of faith, will choose God's direction rather than what seems right to them. And what seems right to them, what seems right to us, is often the most acceptable and obvious choice. But what we're seeing here with Abraham is he chose by faith a difficult land, a land with the Canaanites, with opposition. Lot figured that Sodom and Gomorrah, easy place to get along, easy place to get by with. Everything's provided. There is water, there is pasture everywhere, and life is good over there, so he chose what was good in his own eyes. What was the outcome of it? Horrible, horrible sin as a result of Lot's choice. In fact, as a result of Lot being there, we have the Jordanian people today who are eternal enemies of Israel. How many times did the Moabites and the Ammonites come against Israel to destroy Israel? How many times? Repeatedly, over and over and over. The most dreadful king, and I shudder to call him a king, but the most dreadful king that Israel ever had was Herod. He was a king, Herod the Great. He was an Idumean. He was not an Israelite. He was an Idumean. He was of the people of Ammon. So you see, even with Herod, who was an Idumean, an Ammonite, he brought destruction, he brought hardship upon Israel. So there is nowhere in the Bible that you see anything that's acceptable or pleasant about the people of Moab and Ammon, except in the case with Ruth. Right? And what's the story with Ruth? She was a Moabitess, a daughter of Lot. But she left her entire identity as a Moabite behind her and embraced fully the identity of an Israelite. They were cousins. They were cousins. But she completely left behind her identity, because she knew that her identity as a Moabite was based in the flesh. So the hatred, the animosity towards the people of Israel today from the Jordanians and in history comes from this simple fact that Lot had no right to be there. He had no word of faith, and he acted upon what seemed right to him. We should be careful about our actions, especially when we don't have a word of faith. If you don't have a word of faith about moving forward in God's purpose, stay away from moving forward. Stay back, because you can be as Lot and as the people of Ammon and the people of Moab. And sometimes we choose what seems best, right? Well, quite often we do. If this pasture seems better opportunity over here, then the obvious choice is to go there. That way, it's difficult. Canaanites are over there. Hill country, arid for some of the year. But that's the choice in faith. That's the right choice. That's God's choice. So you venture out in it. And that's what Abraham did. That's the difference between Abraham and Lot. Lot, a man of the flesh. Abraham, a man of the spirit. So, we must choose in the spirit. We must have a word from God. We must obey that word. And then, therefore, walk in the Spirit of God. It's the only way to do it. Faith brings righteousness. So that brings us now to the third point of interest concerning Abraham's righteousness and the covenant that God would ultimately strike with or cut with Abraham. So chapter 14 comes after the separation between Lot and Abraham. Some time goes by now, and the kings of Mesopotamia, they were Akkadians, or they were behaving like Akkadians. Who were the Akkadians? They were raiders. They would come all the way from Mesopotamia and raid cities in the west. So here comes these kings. And the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, the people in the valley, were not paying tribute. These cities in the Jordan Valley were prosperous. Things were good in the Jordan Valley. So good that they embraced the worst type of sin. When there is tremendous prosperity, we find that people turn to the worst types of sin. And in this case, it is the worst. They are engaging in the worst type of sin, which is sexual sin of the worst kind. Homosexuality, clearly abominations before God. So here we have the people of the valley prospering, but they were not paying tribute to the kings of Mesopotamia. So the kings of Mesopotamia comes over, and they raid the cities, and they decided to take Lot. There's a whole narrative behind that we find in the book of Jasher. The book of Jasher is the book that presents Abraham as a breaker of idols. You know the story? That Abraham, he was a breaker of idols. He broke his father's idols. What book does that come from in the Bible? It does not. It comes from the book of Jasher. The book of Yasher gives a narrative as to these kings coming into the Jordan Valley and recognizing Lot and wanting to draw Abraham out, took Lot. This is the narrative. At any rate, they did take Lot and perhaps his entire family, and this did in fact draw Abraham out. How many men went out with Abraham? So Abraham and 300 men of his men went out by night and ambushed the kings of Mesopotamia and destroyed them. He killed one of them, and the others fled as far as the region of Dan, going northwards. So they fled, and he managed to redeem Lot, to save him from certain peril and hardship, maybe even destruction. On the way back, what happens? The king of Jerusalem, the high priest of Jerusalem, Melchizedek, comes out to meet him, and they have fellowship together, they have communion. Abraham pays him a tithe, and things are good. All right? And so he restores Lot to Sodom. Of course, this is before Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. And what happens? In chapter 15 now, we see after he defeated the 4 Mesopotamian kings, Abraham, we see that he is up at night and a bit concerned, expressing some fear. God comes along and meets him in that place and says to him, "Do not be afraid." So let's read now in chapter 15. And of course, this is where God begins to really hone in on the cutting of the covenant with Abraham, and in fact does. So let's read in chapter 15 now. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abraham." When God begins a discussion with us with "do not fear," clearly it means that we're in a place where we're dealing with fear. So Abraham is dealing with some fear here. Fear of what? Perhaps reprisal from the 4 kings of Mesopotamia. But what we're going to see here is that it's likely to do with the fact that he was concerned about his heritage, his nachalah, his heritage. That he did not have a son. He had great wealth, especially after defeating the kings of Mesopotamia. Because what did they come for? They came for cash. When Abraham destroyed them, he took all that they had. So Abraham now, he's wealthy, he has a lot. He has 300 men at least. He's got families that are surrounding him, but he does not have an offspring, a direct heir, a natural son. So what we're going to see here is that this is what is actually troubling Abraham. Right? So how many of us know that if things are not right with our children, that can keep us up at night? What do you think? So is that true? Absolutely it's true. Even when things are good with our children, we still stay up at night, don't we? Well, Abraham is seeing here that he does not even have an offspring. No one to call his son. He's up at night, he's looking at the stars, and God comes along and says to him, "Do not be afraid. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Avram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless? And the heir of my household is Eliezer of Damascus." Avram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he will be your heir." And he took him outside, and he took him outside and said, "Now look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, so shall your descendants be." Now, this is a tremendous discussion between Abraham and God. Note, it is a discussion. God is having a conversation here with Abraham. Abraham immediately, I should say, reflects his concern for the fact that he does not have a son. And this Eliezer of Damascus will be the heir of my house. And God responds to him. Perhaps God knew that that's where he was going with Abraham, and that's where Abraham was going. But the issue became the fact that he had no offspring. God had already promised him offspring. chapter 15, chapter 12. And so, to this point, God said, one from your own body, he will be your heir. So shall your descendants be. Then he believed, Abraham, then he believed in the Lord, and he, the Lord, reckoned it to him as righteousness. The word there is hasab, credit, to give to. So God gave to Abraham, credited to Abraham righteousness because he believed him. Right? So this is a monumental night in Abraham's life. He had a vision. God spoke to him. God even took him outside and showed him the stars and interacted with him. Affirmed to him that your son, from your body will come the promise. And Abraham believes God. And at that point, Abraham becomes righteous. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. He believed God. He became righteous. In Paul's words, he became a man in the Spirit, trusting God, walking in faith. It's at this point that God determines to cut the covenant with Abraham. It's almost as if God was waiting for Abraham to express this faith, to attain to righteousness before he would cut the covenant. Remember, Abraham had already offered up to God 3 times, in Shechem, in Bethel, and in Hebron. God didn't cut the covenant at those times. In fact, Abraham didn't even plan to offer anything to God at this point. It was God who initiated it. So at this point, Abraham is now ready for the cutting of the covenant. I want to say to you that God was preparing for this moment. He was hoping, and sometimes we have to come to the conclusion and be honest about it, that God does not always program us to do what he wants us to do. In fact, very seldom does he. From time to time, he will get our attention and lead us in a certain way. But quite often, God wants us to choose to do what is right, to choose to behave as well, but to choose to believe him, to trust him. And that's how we become righteous. We choose, we believe. He can program us to simply obey. There's no glory in this. There's no righteousness in this. God approached Abraham, and God left it open for him to obey, left it open for him to react. And he obeyed, and he reacted well. And God, at that time, decided that the covenant was to be cut. And he does. Now, while the process of the covenant is being cut and established, Abraham falls asleep. We know the story, and so on. Then God appears to him in his dream. And let's read that interaction between God and Abraham. Same chapter, same night, same event. In chapter 15, 12 to 21. This is a future aspect of the covenant. Of course, the covenant is all about the future. All of it is pointing to a time when Abraham's descendants would be blessed beyond all. And those who bless them will be blessed. Those who all aspects of the covenant is pointing to the future. But this here, what we're about to read, is pointing to the future 4 generations ahead. Let's read. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Avram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Avram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. So obviously it's referring to Egypt. 400 years of slavery in Egypt. But I will also judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation, 400 years. So what does that tell us? That from the standpoint of God, a generation is 100 years, right? Simple math. If 4 generations, 400 years, a generation is 100 years. Then in the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So God's going to bring his descendants back after 400 years, and what will be their condition during those 400 years, they'll be in slavery. He'll bring them back at the end of that process in the fourth generation when the sin of the Amorite is complete. You know that the word complete is shalom. That's exactly the word that's in the Hebrew. When the sin of the Amorite is shalom, not peace. It's not meaning peace. When the iniquity of the Amorite is complete, whole, ready for what purpose? Complete for what purpose? For judgment. So here we're seeing that Israel is counted by God as a vessel for his judgment. When the sin of the Amorites is complete, whole, he will bring the descendants of Abraham into the land. Later on in the book of Numbers, chapter 33, we see it, that God had raised up the people of Israel to be that instrument of judgment against the Canaanites. Another way to look at this is to say that God gave the Canaanites 400 years, 4 generations to repent. God is a God who will lead people to repentance. Does it mean that people would repent? Obviously, the Canaanites didn't. Their condition in the land became worse. Much worse as time went along. So naturally, the descendants of Abraham came into the land, and their purpose was to be that vessel of God's judgment to them, to the Canaanites. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed through the pieces, which passed between the pieces. This is the exact moment that the covenant is ratified, complete. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land. What land? The same land that he walked about on, from Shechem all the way down to Hebron and Beersheba, the Negev, where we're going to go in a few months. That entire land is the land that he's referring to. To your descendants, I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Kadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaim. Who are the Rephaim? Giants. That's what the word Rephaim means, giants. The Amorite, the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. In other words, all of the Jebusites. But what I want us to see here is that all of the Jebusites are referred to as the people of the Amorites. God said that the sin of the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So from God's perspective, the entire land of Canaan, even beyond there, are all the region of the Amorites. It doesn't matter if you're a Perizzite, a Canaanite, a Jebusite, God sees them all as Amorites. So that deserves a word study into the word Amorite. And that's exactly what happened. When God brought Israel into the land, he went after the Canaanites. God did. They were supposed to go after the Canaanites, but they didn't. Not initially. God set it up so that they would. You know the story of the Gibeonites, right? God arranged it so that Israel would make war against the Amorites. But they were all different Canaanite peoples. The point is, God sees Israel as his vessel to bring correction. When the sin, the iniquity of the Amorite would be whole and complete. Now Israel, we know from what Paul said in Romans chapter 11, that Israel's call is eternal. That God ordained with this covenant that he cut on this very night, that the descendants of Abraham would be that vessel of judgment against his enemies. Think about what happened the night before. Abraham was a vessel of judgment against these 4 kings from Mesopotamia. Once that happened, God initiated the covenant with him, his descendants, stating that his descendants would make war against his own enemies. That gift is, that calling is eternal. That's what Paul said, right? The gifts and callings are eternal. He was talking about Israel when he said that. So in other words, Israel today has the responsibility to be God's vessel of judgment against, not the Amorites, but against the Amalekites, the enemies of God. The Amorites were the enemies of God. They had captured the land of Israel, the land that really belongs to God, and they had defiled the land with their abominations. God saw them as enemies. He raised up Israel to eradicate the enemy. Today, Israel has the same responsibility. God said concerning Israel, through the prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 51, that you are my war clubs. With you I will destroy nations. I will tear down nations. In other words, Israel's call and responsibility to be that nation is still active today. And in a way, in the same way that God used the Gibeonites and Israel's unwillingness to take care of the Canaanites, God used that to bring the Canaanites or the Amorites against Israel. I think something like that will happen today. Because Israel certainly doesn't feel like she's able or even willing to address the surrounding nations, right? We understand that. The only time Israel today would move to defend herself is when she's attacked, right? So, is it possible that God will do more or less the same thing to bring his enemies against Israel and Israel will be that vessel of God's judgment? Is that possible? When God brought the Amorites against Israel and Joshua, were there any miraculous aspects to that battle? Did God do anything on his own to be victorious in that battle? You know the battle that I'm talking about? Yes. Against the Confederation in the South. What did God do?
Wasn't that the one where he had the sun stay?
And he brought boulders. He brought huge rocks from heaven that destroyed his enemies before the children of Israel. All he wanted Israel to do was to believe him and step forward in the battle, and he did the rest. So that battle was miraculously decided upon by God's power. He brought the hornets. He brought the rocks. He caused the sun to stand still for 24 hours. How miraculous is that? How miraculous is it? Only today, we, humanity, we're beginning to understand more about our universe, about our galaxy and this solar system. And the more we discover, the more amazing this creation is. This solar system, this galaxy. We're discovering that in this universe, there are trillions of galaxies that are just pelting across open space like frisbees, moving at colossal speeds. That's what we're discovering. That every galaxy is moving at a tremendous speed. And it's, again, like a frisbee. And there's millions of them just flying around, these galaxies. And these galaxies are effectively swirls of matter. Planets and suns and gases, just a swirl. And these swirls are just pelting through the universe. Each solar system swirls together with this galaxy that's swirling. How did God hold that sun in place for an entire day? If this is true, think about what the implications are. He held the sun. In other words, folks, if what we're discovering today is true about the solar system and the galaxy and the universe, he stopped our galaxy. He didn't only stop our galaxy, he had to stop every other galaxy. Think about it. He stopped it for 24 hours, 24 of our hours. Because if he had just stopped our solar system, what would have happened? The swirl would have continued and we would have been crushed. Think about it. How great is God and how miraculously did he show his strength when he did that? And he was willing to do that for Israel, should Israel believe. You see, there's coming a battle like this, and God is setting up Israel for it. And when that battle occurs, it will be just as supernatural. God will do the same things and more to bring that victory to the people of Israel and bring about his final end. We're talking about the Battle of Armageddon, right? That's the battle that's facing humanity, facing the people of Israel today. So God is bringing Israel to that place where she would take her position and stand, be that war club, But he's the one that will bring the miraculous victory. Who will be the general? Who is the captain of this army? What does the Bible tell us? Who is the captain of this great army? The captain of the Lord's host is Jesus. He is the captain of the Lord's host. He is the one that's strategizing. He's putting this battle together. He has the war plans, and he's doing it. Now, I know this is not your Sunday morning Christianity here, folks, but it's the reality of what the Word of God says. We have to choose either the Word of God or the feel-good Christianity that's so available out there. You can get that feel-good Christianity anywhere. I'm interested in the reality of the Bible and in the truth of what God is actually doing. The people of Israel, by faith, whether they act upon it or not, God will bring them to that place where he will fulfill this covenant and ratify the covenant with Abraham fully. Yes, God will end this whole issue when the sin of the Amalekites is complete, whole. And I got to tell you, judging from what we see in the world today, the sin of the Amalekites are pretty close to being complete. What do you think? The nations are in an uproar. It's hard not to become political at this time, right? Why? Because it's a political season, right? Next week, some of us are going to go out and vote. I encourage you to. The people on the left has the destruction of your community in mind. They do. I mean, let's be frank. The things that are being proposed on the left side of the aisle and the things that they're working towards, their agenda is horrid. So you have a responsibility to vote from that point of view. Now, whether you vote in the president, that's a whole different thing. But locally, you should vote. We like what DeSantis did, didn't we? What would have been the case if that other guy was in the office? It would have been we'd have been up to here right now in restrictions, right? So vote. But don't put your hope in the political system. But it is a political season. It is a political season. And to some extent, we do have a responsibility. But God is working this out, folks. I want you to be confident about it. God is working things out in the land of Israel, even here. So I want to encourage you to know that you have an important part in what God is doing. You do have an important part, and God is going to use you, use your faith, just as he has a role for Israel to be carried out, and Israel is accomplishing that role. He has a role for you too in this same process, which is to stand with Israel, to be there to encourage them. 2015, we went there, and God did a miracle in 2015. A miracle with you. Is it possible that something like that is going to happen again at any time in the future? Is it possible that it may happen next year? God is planning to position Israel to be that nation that will ultimately accomplish his greatest will for humanity. Israel is that nation that will accomplish God's greatest will for all of humanity, and you have a part in that. You are the anointing in the midst of it. You are that representation of Messiah Jesus in their midst. Now we will go there, some of us, 25 of us perhaps will go, and the rest of us will stay here and you will pray. You'll come together and you'll get on your knees and you will intercede. And you will be that other half of the body, as the other half of the body, because we're about 50 strong, will go up to the land of Israel and be used by God. We need to see this. We need to believe it. This is what God is doing. And it's powerful. It's powerful. Shabbat Shalom.